Andes in October are not yet brutal. Snow lies in patches along the ridges. Wind scours the rock clean. Altitude presses down on everything. At 4,000 meters, air thins. Breathing becomes deliberate. Cold is constant, but manageable during the day. At night, it drops to 30 below. There are no trees, no animals, no sound except wind. The landscape does not care. It does not offer anything. It simply exists, indifferent and vast, a spine of stone and ice dividing Chile from Argentina. Few people pass through. The few who do, pass quickly. On the afternoon of October 13th, 1972, a twin-engine turboprop carrying 45 people lost altitude in bad weather while crossing the Andes. The plane was a Fairchild FH-227D, operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. On board were members of a rugby team from Montevideo, their friends, family, and crew. They were traveling to Santiago for a match. The flight was routine. The route was familiar. Weather was marginal. Clouds closed in. The pilots descended too early, believing they had cleared the peaks. They had not. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the right wing struck a mountain ridge. The wing sheared off. Seconds later, the tail section separated. The fuselage, now a metal tube without control surfaces, slid down a steep snow slope and came to rest in a narrow valley at roughly 3,600 meters elevation. 12 people died on impact or shortly after. 33 survived the initial crash. They were injured, disoriented, and stranded in one of the most remote sections of the Andes, far from any settlement or trail. Most of the survivors were young men in their late teens and early 20s. They were athletes, in good physical condition. Several were students. A few were older mothers, a middle-aged businessman, crew members. None had mountaineering experience. None had winter survival training. They wore street clothes, slacks, light jackets, thin-soled shoes. The fuselage had broken apart, but a section remained mostly intact. It became their shelter. The interior was cramped, freezing, littered with seats and debris. There was no insulation. Snow blew in through gaps in the metal. At night, temperatures inside dropped below freezing. They huddled together for warmth. They had almost no food. A few chocolate bars, some wine, crackers, candy, supplies intended for a short flight, not survival. They rationed carefully. Within 3 days, the food was gone. The crash site was invisible from the air. The white fuselage lay in a snowfield, surrounded by white peaks. Search planes flew overhead in the days following the crash. Survivors waved, shouted, set out pieces of wreckage. The planes did not see them. On the 8th day, using a small transistor radio salvaged from the wreckage, they heard a broadcast. The search had been called off. Authorities assumed no one could have survived. The survivors listened in silence. No one spoke for a long time. They understood then that rescue was not coming. They were alone. They began to organize. Leadership emerged quietly. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, tended to the injured. Fractures were immobilized with salvaged materials. Wounds were cleaned with snow. There was no medicine. Pain was managed through stillness and silence. Vito Strauch, an engineering student, applied himself to practical problems, melting snow for water, reinforcing the fuselage walls, improving ventilation. Carlitos, Paez, and others worked on makeshift tools. They pried metal from the plane to use as shovels and cutting implements. Discipline was maintained, roles were assigned, routine helped. It gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together. Water was the first critical need. Snow surrounded them, but eating it directly lowered body temperature and led to dehydration. They needed to melt it. Using pieces of aluminum sheeting from the aircraft, they constructed a crude solar water collector. It worked slowly. Sunlight heated the metal, snow melted, water trickled into containers. The process took hours to produce small amounts. They rationed carefully. Everyone received a share. No one drank more than their portion. Food was the second need, and it had no solution. Days passed, hunger became constant. They searched the wreckage repeatedly. They found nothing. Some tried eating leather from seat covers. It provided no nutrition. Others chewed on scraps of cloth or cardboard. These acts were desperate, symbolic. The body does not run on hope. After a week without food, the body begins to consume itself. Muscle breaks down. Fat reserves deplete. Cognitive function slows. Movement becomes effortful. Cold becomes harder to tolerate. They were starving. On the 10th day, a discussion began. It was quiet, careful, and deeply painful. There were bodies in the snow, bodies of friends, teammates, relatives, preserved by the cold. The survivors faced a choice that defied every moral and cultural boundary they had been raised with. They were Catholic. The dead were sacred. Desecration was unthinkable. But starvation was not abstract. It was immediate. It was killing them. They talked for hours. Some wept. Some could not speak. Roberto Canessa later described the discussion as the hardest moment of his life. But the logic was inescapable. If they did not eat, they would die. The dead could not be saved. The living could. They made the decision collectively. No one was forced. Those who could not participate were not judged. A small group took on the task. Using metal shards, they cut thin strips of flesh from the bodies, which were frozen solid and had to be thawed slightly. The meat was divided and shared. It was done quietly, without ceremony. There was no prayer, no ritual. It was survival, stripped of everything else. Some could not eat, others forced themselves. Over time, it became routine. They did not speak of it, except when necessary. It was understood. This practice continued for weeks. It was what kept them alive, but it exacted a psychological cost that cannot be fully measured. They were rational, they were desperate, they were human. These things are not contradictory. On the 17th day, an avalanche struck at night. Snow poured through an opening they had left for ventilation. Within seconds, the interior of the fuselage filled. Survivors scrambled in total darkness, clawing at packed snow, trying to breathe. 8 more people died, suffocated under the weight. The rest dug themselves out over several hours. The fuselage was now half buried. Space inside became even more cramped. Morale, already fragile, cracked. Several survivors stopped speaking. Some lay motionless for days. Despair was not dramatic. It was quiet and heavy. It settled over them like the snow. But others refused to accept it. Nando Parrado, whose mother and sister had died in the crash, became fixated on the idea of walking out. He believed that if they stayed, they would die. He proposed an expedition. A small group would climb west, over the mountains, toward Chile. Others thought it was impossible. The peaks around them rose to 5,000 meters. They had no gear, no maps, no experience. Weather was worsening as spring turned to summer in the southern hemisphere, but altitude kept temperatures lethal. Storms came without warning. Parrado did not argue. He simply began preparing. He scavenged warmer clothing from the dead. He tested his endurance on short walks. He studied the mountains. Roberto Canessa joined him. So did Antonio Vizintin. They were the strongest. Over several weeks, they assembled what they could. A sleeping bag sewn from insulation and seat covers. Sunglasses fashioned from plastic. A crude sled made from seat cushions. They packed small amounts of meat. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, the 3 men left. The remaining survivors watched them climb the first ridge and disappear. The terrain was steeper than anticipated. Snow was soft in places, icy in others. They sank to their knees, then pulled themselves forward. Progress was measured in meters. At night, they dug pits in the snow and lay together in the sleeping bag. Wind howled. Cold penetrated everything. They did not sleep deeply. After 3 days, they reached the summit of the first major peak. They expected to see green valleys, signs of Chile. Instead, they saw only more mountains. Ridge after ridge, extending in every direction. The realization was crushing. Parrado later said this was the moment he understood they might not make it. They pressed on. Vizintin's strength failed. He turned back, taking the sled. Parrado and Canessa continued west. They walked for 10 days. They climbed peaks that required technical skill they did not have. They crossed glaciers. They fell. They got up. They ate their rations slowly, but supplies dwindled. On the 9th day, they descended below the snow line for the first time. They saw grass, then bushes, then a river. They followed it downstream. On the afternoon of December 20th, 72 days after the crash, they saw a man on horseback on the far side of the river. His name was Sergio Catalan, a Chilean cattle herder. The river was too loud to shout across. Catalan threw a stone wrapped in paper and a pencil across the water. Parado wrote a note describing the crash, the survivors, the location as best he could estimate. Catalan rode for help. The next day, helicopters took off from a Chilean base. Weather was poor, visibility was limited. Pilots navigated by Parado's description and by following the river. On December 22nd, helicopters reached the crash site. 16 survivors were airlifted out in 2 waves. They had been stranded for 72 days. They were emaciated, frostbitten, and traumatized. Of the 45 people on board, Flight 571, 16 lived. The story became public immediately. Initial reports focused on the miracle of survival, but within days, the truth emerged. Journalists discovered what the survivors had done to stay alive. The revelation was met with shock, condemnation, and debate. Religious authorities were consulted. Ethicists weighed in. The survivors held a press conference. They were calm. They explained their decision. They did not apologize, but they did not justify. They simply described what happened. Gradually, the tone shifted. Many came to understand that survival under such conditions transcends ordinary moral frameworks. The survivors returned to Uruguay. Some struggled with what they had endured. Others moved forward. Parado became a businessman and television producer. Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. Both have spoken publicly about the experience, but with care and restraint. They do not glorify it. They do not claim heroism. They describe it as something that happened, something they lived through. The psychological scars persisted. Several survivors required long-term support. Bonds formed in the Andes remain strong. They meet regularly. They do not speak often of what they ate, but they do not hide it either. It is part of the record. The incident raised questions that remain unresolved. What separates survival from barbarism? Where is the line between necessity and desecration? The survivors crossed a boundary most people never approach. They did so consciously, collectively, and with full awareness of the cost. They lived. That fact alone does not answer the moral questions, but it renders them less abstract. Survival is not a thought experiment. It is a physical state. The body has needs. When those needs are not met, the body stops. Philosophy does not change that. The crash site remains in the Andes. Wreckage was left largely undisturbed. Snow and wind have buried most of it. Occasionally, hikers reach the location. It is remote, difficult to access, and dangerous. The altitude, the cold, and the isolation are unchanged. The mountains do not remember. They simply continue. The survivors do remember. Some have returned to the site. Others have not. Memory, for them, is not a choice. It is a condition. It does not fade. It does not resolve. It exists, like the cold, like the altitude, like the wind. What happened in the Andes in 1972 was extraordinary, only in circumstance. The responses, organization, discipline, moral struggle, endurance are human. People adapt, people break, people continue. The survivors were not superhuman. They were ordinary people, placed in conditions that allowed no ordinary response. They made decisions. Some of those decisions were unimaginable before the crash. Afterward, they became facts. The line between the unimaginable and the necessary is thinner than most people believe. The Andes demonstrated that. The survivors carry that knowledge. It does not make them special. It makes them witnesses to something most will never see, the edge of human capacity and what lies just beyond it. 72 days. 16 lived. 2 walked out. The rest waited. All of them crossed a threshold. None of them came back the same. That is the story. It has no moral. It has no lesson that can be cleanly extracted. It simply happened. It was real, and it continues to ask questions that no one has fully answered.